Having previously delivered lectures on various aspects of Jewish history, as well as the state parks of Long Island, I would like to follow up on that topic with another region of New York state parks. The state parks of New York are the oldest state parks in the country, beginning with Niagara Reservation that became a state park. It's spread across regions of the state under the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. Examples of state parks include places like Letchworth Gorge, Watkins Glen, Minnewaska, Bear Mountain, Franklin D. Roosevelt State Park in the Hudson Valley, Valley Stream State Park in Long Island, and Brooklyn Bridge Park. Previously, having spoken about Long Island, we talked about parks connected by parkways, making this suburb New York's vacation land. I've also spoken about Jewish history as part of my work at Touro University and the Touro colleges within it. But going back to Long Island, we spoke a lot about Robert Moses, his oversized role as New York's master planner, being in charge of parks and highways at the same time, and using the highways to connect to parks. But today's topic is not about Robert Moses. In fact, the state park region that we're about to speak about has very little, if any, connection to the master builder. We're talking about New York City. And it's very easy for those of us who live or work in New York to forget that there's also a larger state that shares its name. But sometimes we get hints. Places like the Empire State Building, which has the state's nickname, sometimes seeing state troopers on the highways within New York City, particularly places like the Tri-Borough Bridge, I refuse to call it RFK, as well as state highway markers like 25A, which is Northern Boulevard, which continues all along the north shore of Long Island. For the bridges and tunnels that enter our city from New Jersey, you might see the tourism welcome to New York signs. But the most visible reminder that New York City is part of New York State is the MTA. The city's buses and subways and access-a-ride vans and some of our bridges and tunnels, because the MTA is largely a state entity that provides transportation within the city. Now, going back to parks. When you look at a map of New York State, it looks almost like a funnel expanding out to the north from New York City and sliding to the east with Long Island. Most of the preserved public land in the state is Adirondack Park in the north, managed by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and Catskill Park, where most of the city's drinking water comes from. But then you look down towards Long Island, you'll see a few patches of land here, that's DEC and parks, as well as the largest state park, which is Allegheny State Park in Cattaraugus County, and the Palisades Interstate Parks, a series of state parks shared by New York and New Jersey that includes Minnewaska, Bear Mountain, Tallman Mountain, Storm King Mountain, and a few others. But when you think about New York, for most Americans, New York brings to mind New York City. And for good reason, because most people in New York State live in the New York City metro region. Here's the flag of New York City, the Dutchman and the native. Here's the flag of New York State showing Bear Mountain and the Hudson River. When we think of parks within New York City, there's a green ribbon of parks, many of them connected to each other. Some of the most famous examples being places like Central Park, Flushing Meadows, Prospect Park, Washington Square Park, the High Line in the west side of Manhattan. On this map, you can see linear parks like Ocean Parkway, Eastern Parkway, Moshaloo, and Pelham Parkway. You also have parkway shoulders that are managed as parkland along places like Grand Central Parkway and Belt Parkway. And down on Staten Island, the green belt of connected parks and the soon-to-be-expanded Fresh Kills Park. But we're not going to talk about that today. Instead, we'll talk about the state parks. And the oldest example of a state park within New York City is Roberto Clemente State Park in the Bronx, which opened to the public in 1973 at 24 acres. The late 1960s, early 1970s was a time of urban unrest. And Presidents Lyndon Johnson and later Richard Nixon felt that it would be important to bring national parks into the cities because not everybody could afford to visit Yellowstone or Yosemite. And that's how we ended up with things like the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco and the Gateway National Recreation Area in New York City along Jamaica Bay. For a state bringing its parks to New York City, Roberto Clemente was the early example. Originally, it was supposed to be called Harlem River State Park, built in tandem with the River Park Apartments, those tall brown brick towers by Davis Brody Bond Architects, who also built the Waterside Apartments in Manhattan. Roberto Clemente was a very famous baseball player for the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball team of Puerto Rican background. He died in 1972 on a humanitarian mission to Nicaragua, which had suffered an earthquake. He died in a plane crash. Because the Bronx has one of the largest Puerto Rican communities outside of that island, it made sense to name this state park after Roberto Clemente. Located on a thin piece of land sandwiched between the Major Deegan Expressway and the Metro North train tracks and the Harlem River. Mostly concrete and brick with these outdoor pools and playgrounds. But following destruction of the shoreline by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, a naturalized wetland was built within the park, giving it a touch of nature. But if you want to see nature, there's also great views of Washington Heights across the Harlem River, including that tall brown tower, that's Belfer Hall of Yeshiva University, and downstream is the High Bridge. Roberto Clemente State Park is no longer alone. To its immediate south is Bridge Park, operated by New York City Parks. And recently, the city announced a series of connected parks along the Harlem River Greenway, allowing bikes and pedestrians to have a continuous route from Randall's Island along the Harlem River to Van Cortlandt Park at the top of the Bronx. And from there, continuing another 50 miles to the north on the Westchester Putnam Greenway. So you can go 50 miles to continuous parkland. And Roberto Clemente State Park is part of that ribbon of parks. The next park that's of a similar style, also a lot of brick and concrete, is Riverbank State Park, which is built on a rooftop atop the North River Water Treatment Plant. Nobody likes a sewage treatment plant in their backyard. So the compromise struck here with the neighborhood next to it was that there would be a state park on the rooftop of the treatment plant designed by architect Richard Datner, who grew up nearby in Washington Heights. It opened to the public in 1993 at 28 acres, includes a football field, running track, tennis courts, swimming pool, and much more, along with views of the Palisades Cliffs and the George Washington Bridge. This park is built on top of the water on pilings. It's connected to the neighborhood of Hamilton Heights in Manhattan with two bridges at 138th Street and 145th Street, going above the Amtrak train tracks, Riverside Park, and Henry Hudson Parkway. Another park in Manhattan is Hudson River Park. Notice this park does not have state in its name because it was built on state land, managed by a private conservancy and patrolled by New York City Parks officers. It stretches from the Battery Park to 59th Street. It first opened to the public in 1998 and has since expanded to 550 acres. Its story really dates back to 1974. On the elevated Miller Highway that ran along the shore of Hudson River, a truck hit a pothole and was swallowed by the highway. The city at the time was in dire financial strait and couldn't afford to repair the elevated highway. The federal government stepped in with a proposal called the Westway to reclaim land along the river, expanding the island by another block, with a highway either running along this reclaimed land or underneath it. But environmentalists were concerned about the striped bass, launched a lawsuit and a public campaign, and the Westway Highway was prevented. Instead, we have this urban boulevard, West Street, also known as the West Side Highway. Another thing that happened in the 1970s was the decline of the shipping industry along the Hudson River as container ports opened up in Port Elizabeth and Port Newark, New Jersey. Another thing that happened, the airline travel. With affordability of airline travel, passenger cruise ships declined, reducing them to only a few piers in the West 50s. Most of the piers here were derelict, and most of them were demolished. Those that remained became part of Hudson River Park. And each of these piers is unique with its design and landscaping. The light fixtures on the piers evoke the design of the Miller Highway with its art moderne style of the 1920s. There are still a lot of active piers along this river, including the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, the Passenger Cruise Ship Terminal, the Circle Line Terminal, are some of the examples. Pier 76 next to Javits Center used to be a police car tow pound, but previous Governor Andrew Cuomo expelled the police and opened up that pier as for recreation, even though it's a bit distant from nearby businesses and apartments. But there are plans to connect Pier 76 to the northern extension of the High Line. The next state park in Manhattan, and the most recent one, is FDR Four Freedoms State Park, located at the southern tip of Roosevelt Island. This is an example of posthumous architecture. In colonial times, Roosevelt Island was called Blackwell Island after the colonial landowner, and then in the late 19th century became Welfare Island. Yes, this demeaning name, Welfare Island, because in the late 19th century, New York City sent away its undesirable people, the the prisoners, the mental patients, hospital patients, to islands, such as Roosevelt Island. So that became Welfare Island. 1970s, most of the hospitals and asylums were closed, and it became Roosevelt Island, renamed after New York State's former governor and the longest ruling president of the United States. Architect Louis Kahn came up with a design for a memorial at the southern tip of Roosevelt Island that would face the United Nations. But then he died unexpectedly, and the plan was forgotten for about 30 years when a group of admirers of Louis Kahn raised the money and had the memorial built on state land at the tip of Roosevelt Island. I know it doesn't look very natural to have this, what looks like a concrete box from above, and inside it a bust of President Roosevelt, but there are lots of rows of trees here and beautiful views of Manhattan, and as well as quotations from his speech, The Four Freedoms, from the State of Union on January 6, 1941. But that's not the only thing you'll find in this 4-acre state park. There's also the Smallpox Hospital. It's a preserved ruin, meaning it's not going to deteriorate any further, but there's also no plans to restore this building. The plan is to keep it the way it is. Architect James Renwick Jr., a master of the Gothic Revival style in New York in the mid-19th century, whose creations also include the Grace Church near Union Square and St. Patrick's Cathedral in Midtown Manhattan. Next to the Smallpox Hospital ruin is the former Strecker Laboratory, which is also ruined, but then restored on the outside. You can't go inside it because this is a ventilation shaft and escape from the 53rd Street Tunnel, the E and M trains that run underneath the tip of Roosevelt Island. To learn about the history of this site before it became a state park, there's the book Damnation Island by Stacy Horn. The next state park takes us to Brooklyn at 85 acres, Brooklyn Bridge Park. Just like Hudson River Park, this was built by the state, financed by private conservancy, and patrolled by city parks officers. Previously, these were shipping piers run by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. But as shipping moved to New Jersey, these piers were used as warehouses, and Brooklyn has fewer parks in its neighborhoods than the other 4 boroughs. So there was a movement to turn the shoreline into a park with its million-dollar views of the Brooklyn Bridge, Lower Manhattan, and Governor's Island. Much of the park designed by architect Michael Van Valkenburg, who also did Hudson River Park and Federal Plaza in Manhattan. Some of the piers have been exposed for passive recreation, while others have some of their roof preserved for active recreation, such as basketball. There's a canoe launch here and a marina, and a riprap shoreline with a little bit of beach at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Even a book was written about it a few years ago by Nancy Webster and David Shirley. But another unique element of this park is the berm, that serpentine-like raised earth that serves as a noise barrier so that parkgoers don't have to hear the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. Jed Walentis, developer of the Dumbo neighborhood, donated a carousel that's called Jane's Carousel indoors in a glass canopy facing the Brooklyn Bridge. This part of Brooklyn Bridge Park to the north of Brooklyn Bridge has a little bit of a beach, not for swimming, just for admiring. Was originally the Empire Fulton Ferry State Park, named after the Empire Warehouse that's today office space, restaurants, and retail. And the Empire Fulton Ferry State Park was merged into Brooklyn Bridge Park when it opened. Here's another view of that serpentine berm and a diagram showing how it shields the park from the highway noise. Next park in Brooklyn is also a waterfront park. This is in the Williamsburg neighborhood. At 11 acres, it opened in 2007 as East River State Park. It was since been renamed by previous Governor Andrew Cuomo as Marsha P. Johnson State Park. P stands for Pay It No Heed. Marsha P. Johnson, originally a man, became a woman, a transgender rights pioneer, so giving them a place on the map as well. And there's a poster of Marsha P. Johnson at the entrance to this park. Notice how the roads within the park all seem to line up parallel to each other, mimicking the train tracks that used to be there. This is a former railroad yard. And this park is next to city land because to its immediate north is the Bushwick Inlet Park. You can't swim on the beach here, but again, admire the water at Marsha P. Johnson State Park. This is the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal, freight railroad terminal, where the trains came in by barge from New Jersey and points west to the shoreline of Williamsburg. And before it became a state park, it was mostly land used for truck storage, as well as storage warehouses that has since become city and state parkland. Solar-powered lights within this park, Marsha P. Johnson State Park in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. To the south of Brooklyn, on the southern side of Brooklyn, we have another state park. This is Shirley Chisholm State Park. And just like Marsha P. Johnson was originally East River State Park, this is supposed to become Jamaica Bay State Park, but then the state's leaders were inspired to name it after Shirley Chisholm, who was a congresswoman in Eastern Brooklyn, a daughter of Caribbean immigrants, first Black woman to run for president in 1972 under the slogan unbought and unbossed. Prior to being a state park, this was the Fountain Avenue landfill, a huge mound of garbage from the 1930s till 1985 that was then capped and covered with grass. So it looks like an urban prairie, hilltops along Jamaica Bay. And the reason why there's no trees, because it's a very thin layer of soil covering up the fat of the land. There's one book title about the landfills of New York. This is at 407 acres, the Shirley Chisholm State Park. Now, I want to say something also about the state park here. This state park was originally part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. Remember, 1972, a national park within New York City. But while the former Floyd Bennett Field became developed, as well as the Broad Channel Wildlife Refuge, the landfill remained undeveloped. And so the city stepped in. And for many years, there was a sign along the Belt Parkway, Natural Area Restoration. But in the meantime, the mob disposed of its victims in this landfill. Yeah, it's a shady history of this site. Former marshland, as you can see in this 1924 aerial, that has since become expanded into these hilltops. And then the state stepped in. The National Park Service surrendered the land, and it became a state park where you could rent a bike and go zigzag up and down along these hills of Shirley Chisholm State Park. But there's another state park in Jamaica Bay that's much older, at only 17 acres. It opened in 1991, Bayswater Point State Park in the Bayswater, Far Rockaway neighborhoods of Queens on the border of Nassau County. As I mentioned earlier, most of the land along Jamaica Bay is city land and federal land. So city parks here include Bayswater Park, Rockaway Community Park, Dubose Point, Edgemere Landfill, which is being developed as a park. But Bayswater Point is a little bit of state land. Not sure why the state stepped in. Perhaps the city didn't have the money at the time or the interest. So the state stepped in, and the former land that used to be the Hinsheimer Mansion that burned down in the 1980s, all you see today is an outline of the building where the picnic tables are, as well as another summer home nearby that could become a community center or a visitor center or nature center, but instead stands abandoned. Whenever there's budget cuts, this is the first park declared closed, even though you really can't close it. It's just wetland and grassland along the bay. A lot of mosquitoes there, noise from the airplanes landing at JFK Airport, but also great fishing grounds at Bayswater Point State Park. This is a map of Bayswater Point State Park right next to Jamaica Bay Park, which is city park land, facing the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, which is federal land. There's a picture of the Hinsheimer Mansion that's not with us anymore. The gates to the mansion at the tip of Mott Avenue, the main drag for Bayswater and Far Rockaway, and views of JFK Airport. The next state park in Queens opened in 1998 under architect Thomas Balsley and Associates, which included Lee Weintraub, a professor at City College, where I went, at 10 acres, Gantry Plaza State Park, only about 4 to 5 blocks along the waterfront of the East River, giving you the Adirondack chairs, a naturalistic wetland, and beach chairs underneath a Pepsi-Cola sign, facing the United Nations and Midtown. Prior to being a state park, there was a Pepsi-Cola bottling plant here and an abandoned rail yard that gives us these gantry cranes with the word Long Island on it. You see, even though Brooklyn and Queens are part of New York City politically and culturally, geographically, they are part of Long Island. And this is where Long Island Railroad's freight trains had their terminal, bringing in goods from points west. The gantries were abandoned by the 1960s. Today, they are preserved in place, repainted with the words Long Island on it. And the neighborhood behind is Long Island City, the westernmost community on Long Island, though it used to be an independent city, but now it's just a neighborhood within Queens, New York. Just like Marsha P. Johnson State Park, just like Bayswater Point State Park, there's a city park next to this state park, and that's Hunters Point South Park, which is much larger, going to the tip of Hunters Point. I've always wondered, why won't the state park and the city park just merge into one entity? But why not? If the city can't pay for such a large park, that's where the state steps in. But at the same time, maybe the state doesn't want to pay for such a large park. So that's where you have 2 parks next to each other. Go from one to the other. This is Gantry Plaza State Park. And the final state park within New York City is the only one that's on Staten Island. Now, Staten Island does have DEC preserved land, such as Mount Loretto, where the Department of Environmental Conservation manages the land. But largest state park, and the only one on Staten Island, is Clay Pit Ponds State Park at 265 acres. It opened in 1977, so second oldest state park within New York City, after Roberto Clemente. The Native Americans used the clay pits inside this park to create their pottery, And the white settlers followed along with that, creating entire industries here that produced bricks and pottery for the city's residents. After the industries declined, wildlife reclaimed the space. And rather than have developers sweep in, as they've done in much of Staten Island, the state took over the land, acquired it, and it became Clay Pit Ponds State Park, with ponds and forests inside the land. To its immediate east is the neighborhood of Sandy Ground, also known as Rossville and Woodrow, historical African-American community going back to the 1830s that's still there today. West Shore Expressway running right past the park along its edge. This is Clay Pit Ponds State Park on Staten Island. And within the park, you also have a few decommissioned roads. They still have their streetlights, but these streets have been demapped and incorporated into the park, as well as a couple of former farms that are still there today, no longer used as farms, but preserved by the state as part of the park. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on the state parks of New York. Some of you may have known me previously from my book, Hidden Waters of New York City, published in 2016, on the creeks, lakes, ponds, and other waterways within New York City that flow underneath the streets, through the parks, and behind buildings. Perhaps you've seen my work on Forgotten New York, where you have photo essays on the city's history. And I really want to thank Kevin Walsh for giving me that platform for much of the past decade. And earlier than that, I've also worked on the Gray Line New York sightseeing double-decker buses. A very fun, exciting, unionized job that paid my way through college. And over time, I've also worked various jobs within the city relating to communications and public outreach, as well as research and writing. That's what I hope to continue doing, being a researcher, a writer, and a public speaker. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to share it. And for me, this is an example of my experience in public speaking, research, and my love of history. Thank you so much, and I hope to make more videos in the near future.